Welcome, everyone. My name is Diego Gonzalez, and today I'm with.
James Richter. Today we are recording our multimedia writing and rhetoric final project. We opted to go for a podcast style discussion where we will be talking about the problem of living a good and fulfilling life. We thought it was especially relevant considering that nowadays we're living longer and with higher quality than ever, even compared to just 100 years ago, due to new technologies and better circumstances. But this longer life can become an issue if you waste it. So, with more potential and fewer basic worries, how do we figure out what we're going to do with our time?
Yeah, exactly. Today, our goal is to give a general overview of how to live a good and fulfilling life under various theological and philosophical frameworks. We want to see how our thinkers across time guide us toward our path of fulfillment. So, how about we start with our sources? Who did we choose, James?
So, I have focused pretty heavily on modern moral theory as well as some bioethics and just a little bit of raw data. I talked a lot about, or I've read a lot about Alasdair MacIntyre and specifically his work After Virtue, which is a book he wrote discussing modern moral fragmentation. He talks in that book a lot about the idea of a narrative life where it has a concrete beginning, middle, and end. And then, kind of moving on from that, I also looked into the literature covering the debate on aging, death, and human mortality, where whether we should accept our natural lifespan or biologically extend it is kind of the main focus. And then ultimately, I rounded that up with some quality adjusted life years data, which looks at international across all over the world quality of life as well as lifespan for people.
Oh, okay. I brought a diverse mix. I also brought some data in with peer research, specifically the paper on religion in everyday life. I think that'll be really helpful for us in our discussion today. I also brought some Confucian bioethics. I did Google Translate it, so no, anything I do quote from there is Google translated version of traditional Chinese. I also brought some Islamic mysticism through Al Ghazali. I brought Spinoza's mechanics of human behavior and the teleological views of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. I have a personal interest in theology and philosophy, so I wanted to explore how these different traditions framed a good life to these people, and to see what answers lie outside of my own personal framework.
Perfect. Uh, let's get right into it then. Let's take a look at our sources and why we chose them. Diego, what'd you bring to the table?
So yeah, I brought a lot of things. One being the Confucian writer from Southeast University, China. His name is Guobin Cheng. He posits that having an inward transcendence is what ultimately leads to happiness. If I can quote him here, remember this is Google Translate. He says, "If we accept the premise that human beings are fundamentally seekers of happiness, then the philosophy of inward transcendence is undoubtedly more profound and insightful than the modern philosophy of outward transcendence." And this is low-key a hit to us because he argues that the West focuses on this outward transcendence. And I honestly found that really interesting because I'd argue he's right. With my other sources, notably Al Ghazali and Aristotle, being the theological men they were, they very much focus on the outward transcendence of being happy with the divine, which is outwardly transcendent of us. So I think my sources, at least, vary differently, very widely on this topic. One says that we have to look inside ourselves in the Eastern Confucian, almost Buddhist sense as well, and the others argue that we have to go outside of ourselves to find happiness. Give me a little bit on your side.
Uh, I also had a pretty good variance between my sources. The proto longevitism side of things, specifically the author Christine Overall, was who I looked at. Uh, she wrote this book called Immortal Happiness, where it discussed that finding happiness is not possible without, like, being alive is a prerequisite to being happy. So extending life is therefore necessary to grow happiness. So she invented this kind of proto longevitism, or at least discussed it a lot, where since life itself is that primary requirement, we need to extend the quantity of life that we have, which is very different than MacIntyre, who looked a lot at this idea of narrative coherence of your lifespan, where it has a concrete beginning and end. So we kind of and I kind of ended up on this book called the Macropolis Case, which was a discussion of Elena Macropolis, which is a fictional story where Alina is a 342-year-old woman who's physically frozen at age 42 because of an elixir that she's drinking. And eventually she chooses to die by refusing another dose of this elixir because she's just in this kind of straitjacket of having existed for too long. And also, kind of with that idea, just came this concept of the tedium of immortality, where just boredom, coldness, indifference, because you don't have any purpose when you're around for so long.
I see. That's very interesting. This plays a little more onto the what is death aspect of this conversation, but something very interesting that I think plays directly with um, your example there is Aristotle. Um, was question was this from McIntyre?
What I just discussed was actually it was a separate book. It was the Macropolis case as opposed to
Macropolis
McIntyre.
case. Yes. So this is actually quite interesting then because I assume through McIntyre's affiliation with Aristotle that McIntyre would have a similar explanation or view against that. Um, he says, or Aristotle says, that the human nature and like lifespan and death is a natural phenomena, and is actually a good thing to die young. Living long leaves you more susceptible to moral degradation, physical degradation, and overall just you're an impediment to the polis essentially. And I feel Aristotle would have some keen words for your Macropolis situation, essentially saying that dying young is actually ideal.
Absolutely. And I think Elena Macropolis might have agreed by the time she was 340. Uh, Anyhow, kind of along with that, I definitely see the link to McIntyre that you're discussing there, kind of that idea of that narrative of life that I mentioned. Um, then we get to that other side of things where Christine Overall and similar thinkers say that we should be immortal. We should be pursuing immortality, and if we don't, then we're doing a moral wrong. What do you think about that, Diego?
I think, in a sense, that is what Aristotle and Al Ghazali are doing. They are seeking the immortality and the fulfillment of life through the immortal, right? So I think,
Right, but not immortality on this earth.
yeah, that's what I was about to say. Um, I think, in a sense, all humans want to live for a long time. I think it might be just a natural instinct, and that's why perhaps these theologians are making that one of the key goals of life to live forever in eternal bliss. And I don't. I think on the living forever as a moral good has a very core kernel of like a very deep kernel of truth. But I don't think I actually agree with Aristotle here saying that dying young isn't necessarily happy, but it is good for yourself in a sense, and also good for the people who would have to have the burden of you being around. And that sounds a bit dark. And I obviously we should love each other until we're all old. But I do feel and agree that this I don't know this eternal longing to be on Earth on the planet Earth is not really a viable position for anyone to hold and be happy. Besides my lopsided answer, did you have anything that talked more about this in greater depth?
Actually, what you just mentioned about the Aristotle's idea, where even though he talks about dying young, you're still pursuing that immortality, gets discussed a lot in the book Immortal Happiness that I read, where it focuses on the shift in perspective from passive immortality, which is what Aristotle was talking about. It's that religious kind of immortality of the soul, to corporal immortality, where we're physically trying to remain on Earth alive for longer. And it kind of talks about the technological mechanisms behind that, potential for cloning, potential for some stem cell, crazy research, all kinds of things like that. But the ultimate idea was that we are moving from a religious immortality into a physical immortality, which I do not think Aristotle would like at all.
Yeah, I don't think he would like that either. He considers death to be a natural phenomenon, like I said, and he also considers it to be almost a good, for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Degradation of morality and body with that comes with old age. I think he gives the example like that old senile old man, who's always angry. He kind of kind of finds that sad. He had more of a specific focus on the telos, the teleology of life, and something which Aristotle passed on to Thomas Aquinas and do I presume McIntyre as well?
Ultimately, McIntyre.
Ultimately, McIntyre as well. So Aristotle really had a foundational role in discovering and developing this idea of the telos. So, what is the role of the telos?
So, according to McIntyre, telos is a subjective kind of ultimate goal that your life is oriented itself toward. Now, it can take a ton of different forms, and the most important things that he talked about were the fact that people had to come up with their own telos, but it did have to be subjective. So you can't force it upon others. That would be kind of almost tyrannical style where you're telling somebody you have to value this. But kind of religion took the place of a telos, takes the place for a telos for many people because it just is an ultimate subjective thing that you can orient yourself toward. But it's the idea is that the goal that you have in your life or the meaning you have in your life is from that goal you're pursuing.
Okay. I have a question. Was this written before or after his conversion to Catholicism and religion in general?
That's a good question. I'd have to look into that more to know.
Okay, because I find this interesting because every theology that 99% of theologies that exist kind of do state the goal for you. They state the goal of being God, right? They state the goal of uh, being with God forever and ever. That is the goal. That is the final telos of us humans. Kind of, though he was a deist, Spinoza on human teleology says something along these lines, kind of blending the almost subjective aspect to it with also the final aspect to it, the telos. He argues that the final cause or the telos of us is simply a human appetite that we must almost desensitize ourselves from. We must move from enslavement of the passions to a more free state of ourselves, governed by reason. This involves transforming passive emotions into active ones, and increasing one's power of self-control and acting. So the end goal is eventually trying to be with nature itself, kind of free of our appetite, he would say, kind of free of our compulsions and things we would consider bad. He Miroslav Firl, that's my attempt at some Croatian. Um, he, in his investigation of Spinoza, says that Spinoza's predecessors conceived man and nature as a kingdom within a kingdom. They believe that he disturbs rather than follow nature's order. So there's this idea of us humans disturbing the natural order through our either compulsiveness or our one might even say sins, though he was a deist. Any thoughts on that? Besides Spinoza's outright rejection of this final cause as just being a human appetite, do you have anything else to contribute regarding the telos or how someone else might view the telos?
Absolutely. That makes me think a lot of something McIntyre discussed. He talked about how the rejection of shared telos during the Enlightenment left us with what he called modern emotivism, which is basically states that moral judgment and moral judgments, rather, are simply expressions of people's personal preference. And so that kind of subjective approach to everything led to what he called a criterionless choice, where everything around you is almost just a disposable tool to kind of ultimately pursue hedonism or just exactly what you want. And that led to characters like the aesthete. I don't really know how to pronounce it very well, but it's somebody who treats other people as disposable tools just to avoid boredom when you have this kind of extended life, which McIntyre disliked.
Going back to the foundation of Western philosophy, once again, Aristotle argues that the form is the final cause. That's a quote of his. That what humans are is what they are meant for ultimately. Um, for example, whatever something is made for is what its final purpose or purpose is in general. A hammer is made to put down nails. That is its ultimate cause. It is kind of an example. And of course, Aquinas integrates this into his Christian theology and all this stuff, and more arguing that the human is made for God. The human is made to be in constant love with God, and therefore our final purpose, because we're made for that such a purpose, is God. Um, yeah, but keep talking about God and stuff, and I keep bringing us back to Aristotle. What about the eternity, mortality, and the divine? How does that play into your conception of good life according to your authors?
Definitely. So speaking kind of mortality of God here, the eternity and divine play an interesting role in finding meaning. So with secular bioethics, there's a lot of what's called Lucretian symmetry, which is where since we don't fear infinite non-existence before our birth, why would we fear living forever after it? Uh, and that kind of contrasts where that subjective lifestyle that I just mentioned, the emotivism, because some people, like I've mentioned before, would say that extending life is a moral right or even a moral obligation, opposing views saying that life without meaning is simply just duration, and then you end up with the aesthetate characters who simply stomp on everything else to get exactly what they desire.
Yeah, I think an interesting conversation, not one for today, would be how this moral obligation to extend one's lifestyle or lifetime interacts with the secular idea of nihilism, or like that nothing inherently has value or meaning, therefore there's nothing really matters, or something along those lines. I think that would be an interesting conversation for another day. But for me, on the eternity, immortality, and divine, I am a filthy major, so I do have quite an interest in theology. And along that, I brought Al Ghazali, who is a Muslim. I also brought Spinoza, who's a deist, who believes in some sort of cosmic being or order. And of course, Aristotle, who essentially piggybacks, not piggybacks, but he really does expand on Aristotle, bringing it back to it. So yeah, so for my theological sources, I say the divine is the entire point, kind of like I mentioned earlier. Aquinas obviously integrates Aristotle's theology, that grace acts as a formal cause, that grace internally stretches human nature toward its supernatural end, i.e., the vision of God. And Al Ghazali, the Muslim in this case, argues that true worship must be directed away from the shadows of this world toward, quote, the one who is the real, capitalized real, requiring divine grace to free the soul from a self centered life. And a common thread here is kind of, because he was a mystic, his name is Al Ghazali, the mystic. Um, so he did believe, kind of like Spinoza, that we must rid ourselves of these internal, errors of ours. We must free ourselves from these emotions or materialism. And he has quite an elaborate system for this. He argues that there's three dimensions or three worlds that we must conquer before we can reach God, and these sorts of things. So he does formalize it a bit. Well, of course, the ultimate goal being the divine, that, and the point being the mystic he is to quote be quote unmindful of himself, unquote. So at this stage, the shadows of his own existence are overcome by the victorious radiance of the light of the unification of all.
For sure. I think it's pretty clear here that our authors definitely vary immensely. Where I was primarily split on ethical and social lines, you have apologists that view death as natural and encourage maturity with like the idea of a season of life, and then proto longevitists who view aging as a problem and we need to solve that problem via human effort. There's even some kind of extreme ethical proposals where, John Hardwig says in his book, Duty to Die, he argues that individuals should die when they become a burden to their loved ones. Kind of like what Aristotle was saying earlier, once you've become a problem to the polis. It's kind of a interesting line there. Maybe another future discussion we could have about the morality of when it's time to die. It actually makes me think a little bit of Brave New World, where lifespan is very short because as soon as you become a problem to the polis, you basically fizzle out.
That's interesting. So, I know your data kind of talks on this matter. Can you explain a little bit of your data and how what that says?
For sure. So the main focus was it was called the Global Burden of Disease, which is a 2013 study that looked at a standardized empirical framework to compare health loss across 306 causes in over 180 countries across time. So the classification structure used a bunch of levels, a bunch of kind of extra semantics here. Ultimately, what was being looked at was this idea of a disability adjusted life year, which is a metric that is the sum of your years of life lost due to premature death and years of life lived with disabilities. The idea was that instead of just looking at disability or looking at lifespan as a simple number, it's considering quality rather than just quantity. So you have this idea of a calculation or of your healthy life expectancy or your HALE that looks at average numbers of years that a person can expect to live in full health. The reason I thought this was really interesting was because it really tied in well with the contrast between proto-longevitism saying that, like I've mentioned, duration is the most important thing, and kind of this opposing view of McIntyre's of Aquinas's saying that quality and meaning are the most important rather than duration. So the idea was that by looking at the disability adjusted life year data, we'd have a better idea based on global trends to look at this. So looking at some of those trends across the time from 1990 to 2013, there was an expansion of morbidity where global life expectancy increased by 6.2 years, but healthy life only increased by 5.4 years. So people are living more years in suboptimal health is ultimately what that means. So I think where you can tie that in here is there's this interesting conversation that you could consider where people are living longer, but they might not be living better, and they might actually be causing the people around them to be living worse because of the burden that they're placing on them. Somebody has a very financially expensive disability and they're burdening their family. What ought to be done about that, or what ought they to do?
Yeah, that's so. Essentially, what you're saying is you're affirming our presumption that we are living longer, and that what do we do in these circumstances where we do live longer, and how is our quality of life, materially speaking, how is that in play with our lives itself, like fulfilling goal of ours? Um, the data I have kind of would be interesting to see that data in relation to religious views, because the data I have from Pew Research Center argues that yes, religious people do live a happier life in multiple senses. I think this is interesting because it kind of doesn't obviously affirm the theologies or the philosophies of the religious kind, but it does affirm that the systems do work. I can kind of quote it here saying, highly religious people are distinctive in their day to day behaviors in several key ways. They are more engaged with their families, more involved in their communities, and more likely to report being happy with the things, with the way things are going in their lives. And there are some things that are less active in, like um, that they're more attentive to their health or more socially conscious about the environment or about buying products from companies that pay employees a fair wage. So that's just essentially saying they're like everyone else in those aspects. But I do think it's kind of telling of the systems themselves, which these religious people adopt, that they are in general more happy. They are in general more involved with their family, um, regardless of their normality and their sense of working out or exercising. So, if anything, that kind of feel like that gives it more credence because people usually say, working out will make you happier. It'll boost your serotonin or whatever. So I feel like this is almost an additional help to the claim that is made.
For sure. And hand in hand with that is actually in my data, it saw that global age standardized disability years fell by 26.7% over time, which kind of was an indicator of a better public health intervention on like a global scale. So even where overall you see more a higher quantity of life of years lived with disabilities, ultimately the quantity overall is still decreasing because we see third world countries.
Almost graduating into having higher quality medical care, better government assistance, and that's what's causing that ultimate net positive we see there.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting conversation, which I think we should leave to the statisticians and the Pew Research Centers of the world. More generally, as we reach our conclusion here, what was the most attractive to you? What was the least attractive to you? Please tell me.
I had an interesting time between my main two authors that I've talked about a lot here, which were McIntyre and Christine Overall. I'd say that for me personally, McIntyre's theology kind of holds a special place. Sorry, McIntyre's philosophy. His idea of finding a meaning really resonated with me, and I actually looked into a lot of his reading in my high school years because my what I wanted to do was kind of justify to myself like how do people find a purpose and what about people that just don't seem to do anything? What are we supposed to do about people who might be homeless or might be permanently disabled? And McIntyre really kind of swoops in here and he says, well, we need to give them an opportunity to find meaning. And that resonated well with me as opposed to Christine Overall's discussion of, well, we should be increasing their lifespan regardless of how they feel because the value of a year of life is the most important thing no matter what.
Yeah, for me, the most convincing answer, perhaps due to bias and my presumptions about reality and God and all this stuff, and also as an Aquinas glazer in general, I did find Aquinas to be the most convincing answer for me. He gives a very concrete, logical formulation of what the end is to be for us. He gives a very structured and logical formulation of what it is to be or live a good life. Following that our form is our telos, building off that at Aristotle. I liked how he distinguished between like their internal teleology, our natural growth. He gives the example of an acorn becoming an oak, and our external teleology. He gives the example of human artifacts, like a carpenter making a chair. So yeah, I really do think it is my biases that might be bringing me towards Aquinas here. But I also, regardless of my bias, I do find the Confucian ethicist, his distinction between the East and the West to be very compelling. He says that the Western people live less because they have this outward transcendence, which leads to a propensity of greed or something along those lines. Yeah, he says a propensity for dissolute personal lifestyles. He's essentially calling us all immoral when he says that. Well, given this is a Google translation, so maybe I'm being a little less generous there. But he says he has this distinction where in the East, he kind of does place himself in this like Eastern mystical Oriental, tradition. He says that people focus on themselves. People meditate within themselves. People look for the transcendence inward, and the Western people focus on the outward. And I think that's a fair critique, or I wouldn't find it. I wouldn't find it a specifically harmful critique, but I do think it's a fair observation that the West focuses on the outside, and the East seems to, at least from this one author, seems to focus on the inside. My least favorite one, or least convincing one, I like them all though. They all had some good bits and pieces. But if I had to choose one, I would choose Spinoza. This is mainly because he tries to go on a full rationalist spew here, and obviously reason is good, being rational is good. He's only trying to get rid of our emotional senses, and I think that is not something that I would argue for because I do think human emotions are essential to be human. So if I had to say one, I'd say Spinoza. Any any other remarks?
I think we should pretty much just wrap it up here, really. I think all of this kind of just goes to show, a good long life is obviously not a very simple topic, and it's not simply just a biological extension. I mean, considering how I found the argument for simple biological extension the least convincing of my topics, that our focus on deep understanding and purpose and community really help define our ultimate end.
Well, all right then, guys. Thank you for listening. Hope everything was good.
Hope you enjoyed.
Good.